Good afternoon, everyone. Shall we get started? Thank you all for coming. Always good to see a nice turnout like this. It's always impressive to me. Always makes me feel good about what we're doing here, what we're spending our time on, what we're spending our energy on. And I mean, again, there's 50 plus you here. I'd love to see it. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's properly get started. So I do see some familiar names. So a lot of you guys know me by now, so I'm sorry to make you listen to my spiel again, but some of you guys don't know me. So let me introduce myself. My name is Eric Malice. I am the Chief Product Officer here at National Test Systems, and I am also the co-founder. My brother and I started this company in 2001, so we're coming up on 23 years. When we first started, my brother was a really good business-minded guy. He could do sales, he could do inventory, he could do invoicing, he could do all the stuff that you actually need to run a business. I had no interest in any of that. My interest was always wanting to know how these drug tests work, what the different drugs did to the body. I really wanted to know all things clinical toxicology, but especially as it relates to what we're doing here, to drug testing. We're all doing this all day, every day. So, let's learn about it. And again, I see by the turnout here, you guys agree with me, at least to a certain extent. And that's huge because really anyone can send you a cup. We're more than that. We want to make sure you understand it's not like buying linens for the bed. There's a certain level of expertise that is going to help you if you have that level of expertise. And we want to provide that. And again, I like the crowd that I see. It means that you guys want to learn more about these things as well. And more than anything, it's going to make your daily drug testing duties a little bit easier, or if nothing else, at least a little bit more insightful. And again, we bring these to you because it's important, I think. We're not charging you for these things yet. We'll see about all that. But, we want you guys to know this stuff. It's going to help you. And I'm glad you guys see some value in that. And that's why you're here today. So we've got about a 15-minute webinar or so, after which we will do a question and answer. You can see on the left side of your screen, you've got people, questions, polls, chats. If you would put your questions in the questions button. I'm not going to get to the questions until I finish the presentation, but I will get to the questions. If for some reason we really run long and don't have a chance to get to all the questions, just know that your representative will be reaching out to you in the next couple of days. They'll get the question that you wanted answered, obviously. But they're also going to give you an opportunity to request additional training, whether you want to have, you want to make a suggestion for a webinar topic, you want to have a one-on-one training, or, us and your staff together. And again, either on this topic or any other topic. In this topic more than any, by the way, and we'll get there, but this topic more than any really shows just how deep a dive you could really take on some of the subject matter if you really wanted to. So like I said, I take about 15 minutes of your day. It's a decent ask. You guys have jobs to do. I have a job to do. We value your time. So I'm not going to give you a 3-hour webinar at my invitation. However, if you call me and you say, Eric, I need 3 hours more information about this, then I will say, let's do it. Pick a time. I want to help you with it. Let's learn. Maybe I'll learn stuff along the way. Again, we want to teach. So if you want to learn, we're a good match. We're a good match like that. All right. So what are we talking about today? Today we are discussing hallucinogens. So I broke my cardinal rule this time on this webinar, and I'm actually quoting Wikipedia here. So friends don't let friends use Wikipedia as a reference material source, but sometimes they have good phrasing on stuff. And this is the first time I've actually lifted it from them directly. So I had to give them credit. So hallucinogens are a large and diverse class of psychoactive drugs that produce altered states of consciousness, characterized by major alterations in thought, mood, and perception. And I couldn't do better. That's probably the best way to sum up what we're talking about as a class of drugs, as hallucinogens. Let's break it down a little. It is a large and diverse class. We're going to learn both those things. Large as in hundreds, if not thousands, of different hallucinogens that fall, into the hallucinogen category. Diverse, we see a couple of different types of hallucinogens, so we'll learn a little about that as well. And again, this is a 15-minute webinar where there's 50 hours of material on this, so you're going to leave a little wanting more, hopefully, and take advantage of that. Let's schedule something. We find that hallucinogens are both natural and synthetic. We're going to talk a lot more about the natural ones because that seems to be what we're seeing a lot more of these days. You've probably heard of psilocybin mushrooms or magic mushrooms. That's very common these days. Synthetic drugs like LSD or 2CB, some of these other smart drugs that we saw a lot back in the 90s and early 2000s. And we're also seeing a lot of these drugs that are getting either already have, or are getting more and more legitimate medical uses. The example here, for example, ketamine is still being used in dentistry for humans. I had an old manager whose son, it was the best video I've ever seen. It was his, I think, 17-year-old son coming out of getting a tooth pulled from ketamine, and he didn't know where he was. So, we are still using it, though. And by the way, speaking of that, so hallucinogens, I know a lot of people here, I know the names, I know who's here. A lot of you have probably had some history with drug use with friends, family, or yourself. And I see a lot of people who probably haven't and who think to themselves, hallucinogen. Like, why would I want to do that? That doesn't even sound fun. Just know not all hallucinogens are, watching pink elephants dance on a basketball or something. I mean, there's a lot of different effects that fall into this categorization. Usually it's an enhancement in the sound, the smell, the taste, the feel. So it's not all about going off the rails, although we're going to run into some of those as well, because there are definitely some of those within this class of substance. And again, we're taking a kind of shallow dive here. If you guys want to know more, want to talk about a deeper dive, by all means, let's do that. All right, so we're going to do a brief history. Again, we have to do a shallow dive on anything, or you're not going to know anything. So just keep that in mind. Some of these things have been around a long time. One of them, for example, psilocybin, goes back between 9,000 and 7,000 BC. That's like 11,000 years of history that this substance has been used. Mostly for religious rituals or shamanic rituals. It wasn't just everybody walking around high on mushrooms all the time. It was very revered, and it was considered sacred to be able to use these substances going back that far. Ayahuasca is another one. We'll talk a little bit about DMT, which is basically what ayahuasca is. That's been used in South America since 2000 BC. And again, that's more shamanic rituals. We still see that ayahuasca used. There's an ayahuasca retreat in Miami. We'll get to that in a little bit as well. Then we get into our more relatively newcomers to the field. We have 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD for the first time. And again, that was based in in natural occurring roots, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we have the 1960s psychedelic era. We have Woodstock. I mean, we could probably do 10-hour webinar just on the 60s and how acid was such a huge part of our culture at that point in the U.S. history. And then as we see in the 21st century, we're seeing a lot of these medications, these substances being used to treat afflictions that weren't really tried before. And most of what we're going to talk about today has some at least dipping a toe into medical applications, typically PTSD and that sort of thing. So real quick, let's talk about the different classes of hallucinogens. So again, proof of my shallow dive here, we're really talking about the three main categories. We're going to talk about the psychedelics, and that's our classic hallucinogens like acid, LSD or acid, peyote, psilocybin for mushrooms, mescaline, that sort of thing. Then we also can talk about dissociatives, which are a little bit more, when I mentioned off the rails. The dissociatives can get a little bit off the rails. That's substances like, like ketamine that I mentioned before, like PCP, like salvia, like dextromethorphan. Google robo-tripping. I could give you an hour webinar on robo-tripping. But that's dissociative. So that basically means you have a sense of not being part of the world that you're part of. So when I mentioned the elephants dancing on basketballs, that one's a little closer to that feeling. You don't see people using dissociatives typically out at the nightclub. They're locked hopefully in a safe room somewhere when they're doing those. And then taking that even a step further are the deliriants. Now, deliriants, yes, that probably is more of what an inexperienced person might think of as a hallucinogen, where you might see elephants dancing on basketballs. You might wake up in jail. These are things like belladonna, mandrake root. These are things that are basically poison. Not that everything isn't a poison, but these are as close to a poison as someone would take recreationally. Even diphenhydramine, which is Benadryl, that can be a deliriant in large enough quantities. So be aware of that. So which ones are we focusing on today? So basically what we did, and what really prompted this webinar, is we're getting a lot more phone calls about these 4 particular hallucinogens. And I said, well, I could make a 10-hour webinar, but let's do a 15-minute webinar. We'll touch base on it. We'll talk to people who were asking about these things. We'll do some research from police reporting and see if that's really a common thread around the country. And it is. And the 4 that we've come up with that we felt were most important to focus on today anyway. And again, maybe next time there'll be 4 different ones. But right now we're talking about LSD. We're going to talk about DMT. We're going to talk about psilocybin. And we're going to talk about MDMA, or ecstasy. And again, these are what we heard from you guys. These are substances of most concern from our customers, from other people that we talk to throughout the day. So that's why we talk about these things. This is what's important, and let's talk about this. So let's start with LSD. So LSD, otherwise known as lysergic acid diethylamide, probably more commonly referred to as acid. If you look at the image that's shown here, that's what you're looking for if somebody's using blotter, what's called blotter acid, which is basically a paper, a very absorbent paper that's been soaked through with the active LSD ingredient. So if you see a baggie or something with small pieces of paper, not obviously, but most of the time it's going to have some sort of graphic, whether it be a cartoon character or a logo from popular culture. If you see a really finely printed piece of paper that small, especially if it's in a little baggie, you've very good chance that you have acid on your hands, or not literally on your hands, but you know what I mean. So this is, again, acid. We could spend hours and hours talking about the 60s and Woodstock and, turn on and drop out culture. This is probably one of the more popular ones in our culture. And it's making a resurgence. We're seeing a lot more, a lot more LSD use around the country. And obviously with that comes the need to test urine to see if it's, if it's actually there or if it's something else completely. So again, this was first synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and basically became on the radar based on a fungus that grows on certain grains. There's basically rye was the most common bread where this happened. There's a fungus called ergotamine, and the active substance there was called ergot or orgote. That is basically the origins of the LSD. Now, again, this was synthesized, and in the 60s and now today, we're getting the synthesized version. There's probably not a lab somewhere where somebody's letting bread mold properly. But I mean, if you go back in history, there's all these times where there's like mass hallucinations, and it turns out it was just because they let the bread sit out too long. So yeah, it's been there, but it wasn't properly identified and resynthesized until the 30s. It wasn't really becoming a thing until the 60s. And again, now we are seeing a resurgence in LSD. Next on our list is DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, or N,N-dimethyltryptamine. And this is a very potent hallucinogenic compound found naturally in certain plants and animals. And again, this is the South American shamanistic drug called ayahuasca. It's become more popular again. And as I mentioned at the beginning of us, there is a retreat in Miami where you can spend, I say Miami, by the way, because we're in South Florida. There's a retreat in Miami where you can spend like $2,000 and go on an ayahuasca trip, again, DMT. And it's sort of legal in that it's a religious ritual. So there's certain laws, obviously, that can't be, they can't interrupt with that too much. But we are seeing it a lot more popularly as far as people misusing it or just using it recreationally. So we do get that call a lot about DMT testing. So know that, that's here too. Back in the 60s, they used to call this the businessman's trip because it's a very short trip. LSD, for example, you could be tripping, as the parlance is, for 8 to 10 hours. Ayahuasca is typically more of an hour or 2-hour trip. So the nature of that, they remembered, they thought to call it a businessman's trip. It's weird, but I thought that was interesting enough to share. And again, keep in mind, this has been in use since 2000 BC, so it's certainly not a new substance. I mean, it's in use. Maybe not as popular as something like ecstasy we're going to get to, or acid, but it's there and it's being abused or misused, and expect to see more of it if you haven't already. Next, we're going to talk about psilocybin. So psilocybin is the active ingredient in what we call magic mushrooms. P. cubensis is the class of mushroom that it is. And there's actually a very wide variety of mushrooms within the same taxonomy that have the same psilocybin compound. Interestingly enough about psilocybin is inactive, really. It doesn't do anything. If you were to eat psilocybin by itself, will not affect your body at all. However, as soon as you ingest psilocybin, your body immediately metabolizes that psilocybin into psilocin, and that's the actual active compound that has these psychedelic effects. We see this with other drugs as well. For example, heroin's inactive, but once you take heroin, your body turns it into 6-MAM, 6-methylamphetamine. 6-methylacetyl morphine. And that's the part that actually has the effect. So it's a similar thing here with mushrooms. Again, 9,000 BC, we're going back 11,000 years that we can find use of these things. Other things, for example, that fit into the hallucinogen category, THC, for example, every major culture in history of the world has been found to have used cannabis at some point. So these things definitely have longevity. So keep that in mind. They're not something that just rolled, that we just figured out yesterday or anything like that. Excuse me. And then lastly, we're going to talk about MDMA, which is more commonly known as ecstasy. The chemical name is 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine. You'll note those last few syllables at the end, methamphetamine. It is very similarly structurally related to methamphetamine, with some minor alterations, obviously. Most commonly known, like I said, ecstasy or X or rolls or beans. I mean, every different drug has a million street names. These were originally synthesized in 1912 and probably made the most commonly popular from our rave culture, electronic dance music scene. Starting with MDA back in Studio 54 days, and then we went to MDEA, and then went to MDMA. And again, there's another 50 substances that are very similar structurally, but MDMA is the one that became the most popular. Also, common name for MDMA is Molly. So Molly, in intent, is supposed to signify pure or high quality, pure MDMA. As with most street drugs these days, that's probably not really the case. You're probably going to find fentanyl in it. You're probably going to find xylazine in it. Any street drug is already problematic in this modern age, as if it wasn't already. But MDMA is probably one of those things where someone would say Molly, and it would turn out to be anything except Molly. So keep that in mind, that most street drugs, if somebody comes to you and says, I should be positive for ecstasy, I took a Molly pill. It probably wasn't. We see a lot of that, a lot of that. Testing for fentanyl instead, or amphetamines. So those are the big four. Another reason why these are good examples is because luckily there's tests for all these. So again, we pick tests based on what people also are looking for more than anything. So for example, we have urine testing for LSD. It does have a very short window of detection, typically between 8 and 48 hours. We have a urine test for DMT, which is, again, that ayahuasca. That's also a short window of detection, about 24 hours. Psilocybin, we do have a test for that as well. Detection on that in urine is usually about 24 hours. And then MDMA or ecstasy, typically about 3 to 4 days, more so if it's used in a much higher quantity. It doesn't build up over time like THC does, but it will. If you've got a chronic user of MDMA, you've got a little more detection time. Saliva is a little bit behind the curve regarding testing. Right now, we do have testing for LSD with saliva, and we also have testing for MDMA via saliva. And in well, not the best thing, but one of the nice things about all of these is they can be done as service testing. Now, DMT, for example, typically is a powder, so that's easy. You mix it with some distilled water and use the regular dip test. LSD, you might have to soak that little blotter paper in water. Psilocybin, you probably have to soak those mushrooms in maybe warm water to release some of that psilocin if it's actually in there. And then MDMA is typically a powder that should dissolve fairly easily in water. So we definitely have some good testing options, and that if you know and if you can detect it and if you can you can nip it in the bud, that's really half the battle there. All right, I don't see any questions. I see chats. Let's see if somebody stuffed a question into here. I know here, of course, it's always there's always audio problems somewhere. Oh, I see a question pop up. We're going to see people talking about using peyote. Yeah, it doesn't. So peyote is a naturally occurring. It's a cactus found in southwestern United States. It doesn't seem to be as I hate to use the word popular. How about widespread? We're not hearing as much about it from you guys. I'm not seeing as much about it in the police blotters or anything like that. A, no, there's no test for peyote, sadly to say. But B, it doesn't seem to be very widespread at this point. That's it? One question? All right. Either put you guys to sleep or... yes. Oh, I mentioned, thank you, Duan. I meant to mention that at the beginning as well. We record these webinars. So if there's somebody who was hoping to make it but couldn't, we'll have a post on our website usually within a day or two. If you want to shoot me an email, or actually, you know what, I'll tell you what, we have these comments. So I'll see your comment and I'll make sure we get you a copy of the slideshow and the recording if you'd like that as well. We have clients smoking a crystalline rock substance, which they think is closer to bath salts than MDMA. They're not ingesting it, they're smoking it. So there could be a couple of things. We are seeing a lot of other mushrooms or psilocybin type things that they can take the active ingredient and crystallize it. There's just so many new things. It really is hard to keep up with. Testing will probably never keep up with it. I can do some digging. Do you know if they're using it do you know the effect that they're getting from it? Because if it's going to be like an effect like hallucinogenic, then it's probably one of these new mushrooms that we've been hearing about recently. If it's more, THC-like, then it might just be one of the deltas. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are hundreds and hundreds of drugs that fall in this hallucinogen class, and we have tests for 10 of them, say. So there's 100,000 drugs out there. You're never going to be able to catch them all. So hopefully word gets around and you can, pay attention based on, if nothing else, rumor and hearsay, then you'll at least be able to stay on top of it. Let's see. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more about dissociative hallucinogens soon, Lauren. Yeah, reach out. Let's do it. I could talk to you for hours about PCP and ketamine easily. Call it Molly. Okay, that's interesting. Let me do some looking into that, Sandra. I have not heard that yet, but honestly, sometimes I do rely on you guys to be my first line of defense, because I can read stuff all day online, but unless you're seeing it firsthand, then it gets back to me sometimes. Sometimes I'm not the first one to know, but interesting, Sandra. Okay, I'm definitely going to look into this because now I'm super curious. You've given me a puzzle, and that's the best thing I could hope for at the end of a webinar. So, all right, looks like that's everybody. Listen, guys, thank you so much. Thank you. I love that you guys come here and join us with these. You guys have, like I said, you got work to do. This isn't easy for you to get away for 15, 20 minutes just to hang out with me. When you're ready and you want to do an hour with me, let me know. We'll absolutely do it. Reach out to your consultant. Reach out to me directly either way. But yeah, thanks again for everybody for coming. Really appreciate you. And until next time, keep on testing.